This video is all about Melek, Reforged researcher. And in the process of making this video, I kept asking myself, why is no one playing this guy? He's absolutely busted. Melek's a powerful commander that both reduces the cost of our spells and works really well on a budget. And he'll allow us to do some pretty silly stuff, like this, and this, some of this, and definitely a lot of this. And yes, that is our typical in-game board state. If this looks like fun, you're in the right place. And no messing around. Let's get straight into the deck list. Starting with our creatures. Well, creature is more accurate. Yes, we run a single creature in our deck. It's just Melek. And that's because creatures feel really horrible to draw once we have Melek in play. Having less of a board presence also makes us seem like less of a threat, which means players typically leave us alone, more than they probably should. Our mana base is pretty simple. It's not great, but it does get the job done at a budget. Our mana rocks are a little bit more interesting, and there are a few things to call out. Firstly, you'll notice there's no Soul Ring, and this is because once we play Melek, we have very little use for colorless mana because of the way the deck is built, and you'll see what I mean shortly. Instead, I spent that budget on Sonic Screwdriver, which does a whole lot for us in this deck. It gives us colored mana, it can scry for us, and most importantly, it can make Melek unblockable. Second, we're running some tapped mana rocks, and while they work perfectly in this deck, they do tend to be a little bit divisive. In this deck, we don't do much that requires untapped mana rocks in the early game, and after Melek is played, we're probably not going to be playing mana rocks at all because we've got more efficient things to do with our mana. Milliken and Deranged Assistant are already good here because they help us ramp out to Melek, but also help us mill some instants and sorceries into our graveyard in the early game. In addition to our mana rocks, we've also got our ramp spells that double as card draw. These help us accelerate Melek out a little bit earlier so that we can start abusing his ability. It's critically important that we have at least one instant or sorcery in the graveyard before we cast Melek, because otherwise he'll die, and these are great for that. This deck runs a lot of card draw, both draw-focused spells, and spells that do other things that also draw us a card. That's partly because I'm greedy, but also because this deck feels really bad when one mana floods. Melek is also going to be a target, so we run a lot of draw to make sure we draw into all of our protection. In this section, we have our early game card draw, which we hope to cast before we have Melek in play. The goal here is really to get some instants and sorceries into the graveyard, as well as make sure we hit our land drops and find some protection for when we cast Melek. Half of these will be just as good after we've played Melek, because their single blue casting cost is just fantastic. Then, we have our post-Melek card draw. Cards that create a lot of value, and are the engine that keeps us going as a control deck so that we can meet all the critical threats to our game plan with an answer. All these cards feel really great to play once we have Melek on the battlefield, but shout out to Pore Over the Pages, as it's effectively a free draw spell. Practical Research and Thor Flare both dig us 4 cards deep for 2 mana. And lastly, given I love cards that have multiple modes, Soul Read is a counterspell that can also draw us some cards in a pinch. As I've already mentioned, Melek is going to be a target, so we need to protect him. Scatter Arc, and by extension Contradict and Dismiss, feel really good in this deck, as we get to say no bueno and draw a card while we're at it. Mystic Confluence provides a lot of flexibility, be that countering something dangerous, dealing with a threat, or even saving Melek and getting us a card while we do it. I had a game recently where someone tried to steal my commander the turn cycle that I played him. In response, I used Mystic Confluence to counter their spell, bounce their commander, and draw a card for 2 mana. Now that's pure control filth, but it did feel very good. Sometimes we do want a backup counterspell that's not going to cost us 4 mana, so whilst it's not 100% synergistic, we're running both Negate and Dispel to fulfill this role. A control deck would not be a control deck without some removal. And you're going to spot a trend here, because our single target removal also nets us a card. Repulse and Leave in the Dust can also double as an emergency eject button for Melek if someone's going to kill him and we have no other sources of protection. We then have a bunch of board wipe effects that we're going to be using defensively 90% of the time. Cards like Washout, Etherize, and Ether Spouts also do a great job of dealing with a singular problematic player whilst not simultaneously demoralizing the whole table. And a special shout out to Shanna's Ignition that can also act as a finisher. Now, our deck does a lot of milling, so we've got a couple of recursion effects to get important spells back. Mystic Retrieval is the GOAT, as we can flash it back once we've milled half our library. Whilst not strictly recursion, we've then got two cards that we use to give our commander evasion, so that we can one-shot people. Critically, both of these have the ability to be cast from our graveyard, which is again particularly useful if we've milled half our library. And lastly, given we're speaking all about milling, we've got our real win condition when paired with Melek. Milling our library to send Melek's power over 9,000. Shout out to Tunnel Vision, which is a card I'd never seen before, which, while higher risk than Cut Your Losses or Traumatize, tutors up a card and fills up our graveyard while we're at it. With the deck list out the way, let's talk a little bit more about the deck and how to play it. I decided to build this deck because a viewer said they were keen to see some control decks, and I thought that could be a fun challenge. But I'm going to be honest, despite being an avid control fan in constructed formats, I don't really love it in Commander. The idea of sitting there staxing off, dropping offensive counterspells every other turn, or just playing board wipe tribal till you win the game in 2 years bores me to tears. Not only that, but I don't play Commander to lock the game down and see the light slowly drain from my pod's eyes until they're a husk of their former selves, wishing for an end to their misery. I save that for my opponents in 60 card formats. Instead, control for me in Commander should mean employing a strategy that does just enough to keep ourselves alive, whilst simultaneously allowing our opponents to play their game and lulling them into a false sense of security as we finesse our way to the win. So, how are we doing that with Melek? Well, our goal is to get Melek in play, preferably with some protection in hand, and then proceed to play a spell every turn. Yes, that's 4 per turn cycle. Digging through our deck, protecting ourselves until we can mill half our library, and give our opponents the old Melek 1-2. When it comes to playing the deck, there are 3 key phases for me. There's the early game, aka getting to Melek, then the mid game, which is when we've played Melek, but are just surviving because we're not strong, and lastly cruise mode, where we've managed to keep Melek alive and are enjoying the value generated by him, as we're now building towards a game-winning board state. The first step on that journey is obviously our opening hand. The ideal opening hand has some land, a mana rock, and ideally some card draw, especially if it's one of our treasure creators, and lastly, maybe a counterspell. The focus, however, is definitely on having enough land and enough ramp. Our early game is pretty straightforward, and I've already mentioned about how all we're really trying to do is get Melek into play, with some backup in our hand. So as long as we're hitting our land drops and we're ramping, you're doing the right thing. More importantly, let's look at surviving once we've got Melek out. This is going to be the bulk of our game, and will revolve around us holding up mana to either counterspell or protect Melek. If, however, we don't do either of those things and we have mana available, we refill our hand and repeat. By this point, Melek should be getting beefy enough so that our opponents don't willingly want to attack into us unless they have absolute chonkers in play or they have a very wide board. We pair our beefy Melek with some removal and stay alive that way. Once we're stable, our goal is to dig to find one of our mill spells. This will easily turn Melek into a 25-25 or bigger and put any of our opponents in one-shot range, allowing us to start using our player removal, especially if we have one of our evasion cards. Every deck has weaknesses, and this deck is no different, and we have 2 key weaknesses that we have to play around. Firstly, we're pretty weak and slow until we untap with Melek in play. Now, it's incredibly unlikely that the entire table decides to focus us before that, but if they do, we probably don't have enough to deal with it. This is, however, true for most decks. Then, secondly, our entire deck revolves around Melek, which is an obvious weakness. Whilst it does play incredibly well, and doesn't really concern me, you have to play very carefully around removal, and therefore need to both watch your opponent's mana and be careful about tapping out to play a draw spell on the end step before your turn without having mana up to protect Melek. I'm really happy with how this deck plays, but there are of course possible upgrades. That said, I do think one will hit diminishing returns pretty quickly as one starts spending money on this deck. The upgrades that I would consider adding, for the most part, will just swap out our existing budget options for stronger cards in the same category. Counterspells and protection is arguably the best place to spend the budget, as it'll give us free spells, which can help us out a lot when we're trying to juggle keeping our commander protected whilst tapping out at the end of a turn. Force of Will, Fierce Guardianship, and Deflecting SWAT can be especially important here. On the card draw side, the only spell I think is really worth adding is Seagate Restoration. For removal, one can obviously add something incredibly strong, like Cyclonic Rift, but River's Rebuke was an interesting one for me. I'm not sure how much it's an upgrade, probably more of a side grade, but it does have the potential to deal with very problematic players, almost far better than anything else we have in the deck. Last but not least, whilst not critical, any of these lands will dramatically improve our mana base. And that's that. A base take on Melek Control. As always, if you have thoughts or questions about this deck, please, I'd love to hear them in the comments below.